Yeah, so is this the best balanced season of all time?
It's pretty good, yeah. It's quite good.
not the start that Dratnos thought I was gonna give him. He's like, oh wait a second.
Just kind of jumping right into the meat of the episode, but that's what we're talking about this week is the class, not just the balance, but the tuning passes that we've seen so far over Dragonflight Season 1 for both Raid and M+, not talking about PvP, of course.
Yeah, and it's more also like, are there any reworks we'd also like to see in 10.1? That kind of thing, because I think that's also important, because some specs have actually gotten a decent amount of changes. We know that Druid got a lot of changes in 10.0.5. We know that Paladin is getting the brunt of the changes in 10.0.7. Shadow Priest also got changed a lot in 10.0.5 as well. So I guess we can start by looking at kind of where we came from in regards to DPS rankings. I mean, obviously this isn't perfect. I think that we're just going to talk generally about like how classes have been performing, like what they've been looking like these days. I mean, we have some of these charts from Wowhead from week 6, whenever they first started showcasing like what mythic damage rankings were looking like. And, it kind of depends on the boss where classes were good and whatnot, but we kind of were starting to get like a general idea. This was after some of the early tuning as well, but before 10.0.5. But I think
I mean, you got to take it with a big grain of salt. Any Warcraft log statistics screenshot is very small, and often it's going to be influenced, like you said, by some specific boss fights and stuff like that. But it does still give you an indicator, especially when you kind of squint at it a little bit and zoom out, and you're just looking at it compared to other seasons. How far are the gaps between the top performing specs and the bottom performing specs? How it is, because often there's a season where there's like a fire mage that's 20% ahead of some of the other ones.
Look at where Dev Evoker was relative to like Survival Hunter. I mean, that Survival Hunter was the only one that was like, okay, I mean, you were starting to see some like clear trends where some specs were starting to like gap others. Since then, we've had like a couple of rogue nerfs, and then a bunch of specs just honestly getting buffed. I don't even think we've seen too many nerfs outside of rogue. But then again, now if you look at like what it looks like today, somehow assassination at the bottom, but this is like to overall statistics, which of course are always skewed. Survival Hunter has gained a little bit of traction. Shadow, and we have some new contenders at the very top as well, with like Shadow Priest and Arms Warrior receiving pretty significant buffs and changes. So it's just one of the situations where but Blizzard was continuing to iterate on feedback that has been given. And it was something that we talked about. It was like, oh yeah, is Heroic Week, or is the lack of Heroic Week going to be a major pitfall and a balancing concern for Blizzard moving forward? How are you kind of feeling about that now? Do you think that they've landed mostly in an okay spot?
Yeah, I mean, the Heroic Week concerns were more about how is the Race to World first, how is the first month going to look? And I think they landed pretty good on that. They did some Heroic Week balancing. They did some, I guess, Mythic Week balancing in this case. Some early weeks, we saw some 3%ers in both directions to a couple of different specs. There's been a few specs that they've kind of gone back and forth on as well. Like if you look at Hunter, Hunter's like buff, nerf, buff in an interesting way over the past several patches, or like several hotfixes. But yeah, I think that's a sign of good stuff. I think that the size of the buffs and nerfs that we've been seeing to these specs as well, like a lot of specs have gotten, a 3% or a 5% or something like that. And then a couple of weeks later, it's like, okay, this could still use a little bit more. They get another little bit. And yeah, I think we're at a place right now where if you look at most metrics, specs are within a couple of percent of each other. Maybe there's still some that are hugely more valuable in terms of utility that they're bringing than others. But for the most part, I think it's quite good for the DPS spec, like damage numbers balance in Raid.
And that was something I was about to say, is like most of the time, whenever we look at these charts and stuff on the Wowhead, they're almost always damage focused.
Right.
Whereas if we look at the healing side of things, we've actually seen fewer changes to healers. Okay, so whenever we talked about DPS, I specifically stated that they kept buffing up the worst specs over and over again until they got them in a state where they were a little bit more competitive and whatnot. For healers, they've only been kind of like nerfing things. I guess Mistweaver Monk and Restoration Shaman have gotten a little bit of buffs, but overall they've kind of just been nerfing stuff.
Priest got some buffs as well, right?
Yeah, Priest got a little bit as well. But Preservation and Resto Druid have been taking the brunt of the changes from healers, but a lot of that's just been like throughput nerfs. I guess, okay, yeah. Priest did get a couple of changes as well, which helped them. also.
I think that, again, the direction of the changes has been mostly good here. It's tough whenever you look at like a healing graph, right?
It's
this
so bad.
isn't including damage reductions, which Holy Paladin is bringing Devo Aura, right? Discipline Priest is bringing Barrier. So when you factor that in, that increases the amount of effective healing that they're bringing to a raid. That being said, Preservation has been a pretty big outlier this tier, and I feel like has been a kind of probably the biggest point of raid imbalance this tier has been in the Preservation Evokers. I think that's been the
you want to look at a fight
largest gap for the longest.
You want to look at a specific fight to see healing?
Sure, yeah.
Which one?
Razageth?
We do Razageth, yeah. Let's look at rankings. And then we just classify it by healers, and then it's like, how long is it going to take us to see anything that's not
all classes was there. Yeah, I guess healing.
It should be healing, right? And so it's just like, when is the first non-preservation evoker going to be? Okay, so we got a Resto Druid down.
Innate the Druid, yeah. We got Druids and Mistweavers, of course, throughput specialists as well. Although Preservation is like throughput and time spiral and rescue on that fight.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean it's a little bit. It's also they're doing a lot of damage too, which is kind of crazy too.
Okay.
But yeah, the raid side of things, I think pretty good. And when you think about raid tanks as well, we talked about. I think the healer is probably the weaker than DPS. Tank balance is pretty good too in raids. People have talked about Warrior this season, and Warrior is definitely good, but it's not actually. I'm not sure it's actually the best tank for the last two bosses. Like, if you were on progression now and you could have any equally geared tank, I'm not sure I would pick Warrior for those fights. Like, it's good. It does quite a bit of damage, but DK utility is huge. Brewmasters are insanely tanky against those fights.
It's interesting because Bear Druid is typically seen as like the weakest tank, but for some reason it's showing up at the top of the damage across every single fight over the course of the whole entire raid.
Well, so that it can do a lot of AoE as well with the with the right build. So maybe that's just Primal Council padding. Changes to damage to bosses. Let's look at damage to bosses on,
sure.
On this.
On
this graph,
just with like interesting.
Still, yeah. The Bears, I guess. Maybe it's also partially just a smaller number of parses, more devoted fans of the spec. But yeah, Bear damage is not the weakness of that class, right? The weakness of that class is the like the defensive side of things.
Okay, I think that we would be remiss to not look at M+ a little bit as well. M+ has actually been on the more interesting end in regards to just class representation. I think that the best way of actually looking at M+ DPS specifically is just like kind of look at like 20s and up. That way you can kind of get a general estimate of like what people are bringing to 20s. I mean, even if we sort this by 25s, I think we're seeing a bit more representation, pretty much more than ever before. With some things obviously starting to become outlier at 20s. Pretty much everything is viable at this point. You can do a 20 on pretty much every single DPS specialization.
And it's worth noting as well that the 20 breakpoint is where you get the best rewards as well. So there's incentive to be playing 20s as every class, right?
This is the trickle down.
Once you get to the 25s, this is where you start seeing what the like really push comps are running. And here it's, there's a couple of good specs, but when you compare this to previous seasons, there's a lot of viability, right? Subtlety, Outlaw, Shadow, Enhancement, Mage, Warlock, Windwalker, Balance, Feral, Havoc, like all of these specs are seeing a lot of representation or are really good even if they're not being represented. And then the other classes that aren't seeing as much play, some of that maybe there could be some changes to their AoE profiles. We know there's stuff coming for Ret, for instance.
Yeah.
That might help them bust into this scene, but still this is quite good for M+, like for an M+ graph of 25 and up. This is quite good.
This might be some cope as well, but I mean, we see DPS warriors. I don't want to say consistently top groups. We see DPS warriors sometimes in top groups, and if they're playing with the DPS warrior, you're like, oh, that's not too bad. If you see a hunter in a group, you're like, oh, their damage is good. Yeah. They're lacking in some areas, but you're like, oh, okay, this class's damage is good. I mean, it's just like Devastation Evoker. I think that Devastation Evoker and like Ret Paladin are the ones that I've seen like the least representation.
I think Dev Evoker in both Raid and M+ as well is like there's this expertise with the spec that people are still building up, and once they get really good at it, I actually think that's a spec that has a lot of potential. And from what I hear, like the evoker of my guild talking there, it does seem like there's a huge amount of like of skill expression you can get with that spec that the muscle memory is just not there yet.
All right, and then obviously I've swapped it to 20s again, and we can look at tanks. You're seeing a lot of Prot Warriors. Prot Warrior was very dominant early on. It was projected in M+ to be one of, if not the top tank. And so a lot of people, if they were dedicated to doing M plus at that tank role, reroll to Prot Warrior.
But a lot of them are now rolling over to Paladin. Paladin is
I mean, look at the front page, man.
Is bananas, yeah. There's a lot of good stuff you could be doing, and Brew, DK, also phenomenal.
So, but yeah, I mean, if you look at 20s, pretty much all of the tanks have some level of representation. It's not too bad. Obviously, 20s are doable as any tank. If you swap to 25, that's where you start to see, okay, now it is just like mostly Prot Warriors, mostly Prot Paladins, and then some Blood DKs. You have a couple of Brewmaster Monks and Vintage Demon Hunters, but those are not seen as frequently as these top three, and particularly the top two are the most dominant. But it's better than most other seasons. If you look at Shadowlands Season 4, I'm pretty sure this is only going to be Blood Death Knights, for example.
Yeah, compared to that, yeah, exactly. Look at that thing.
This is probably the right Shadowlands Season 4. Yeah, but I mean, dude, okay, 45% is Blood Death Knight.
That was Season 4 post as well. Yeah.
What's the correct Season 4?
I think about the top one. Yeah, Season 4.
This one.
Yeah, there it is.
Where
59%, right?
60%. All right. Whereas, all right, at least you have some representation in the tank role. It's always going to be difficult for you to get more than 2 tanks. Honestly, if you have more than 2 tanks represented, the role is in a pretty solid state for the ability to be able to have that skill expression from players. Now, healers has been a very interesting one, and it was Preservation Evoker and Resto Druid on the beta. It's been pretty much Preservation and Resto Druid throughout the whole entire time on live as well, to the point where Pres and Resto Druid have been catching nerfs, not mostly, but sometimes just aimed at M+ specifically for what they're doing in these dungeons. And it's very difficult to see a world where it's not just Resto Druid and Preservation Evoker even still. And I mean, look at this 40-40 at 25 and up. And
yeah. Which, so kind of mirroring Raid, right? It's like the weak point of this season is, in terms of balancing, it does seem like it falls largely on the healing role.
Yeah.
Where there's maybe it's buffs to the other 4, maybe it's nerfs to the evokers. That the evokers have taken a little bit of nerf, but I suspect it's like way ahead, and it's taken some 5%ers, and maybe eventually that catches up with it. But I think that it's a little bit far.
But yeah, I mean, even if you look at 20s, it looks like, I mean, there's representation from all the healers, but you've already seen a noticeable trend. Whereas, like, if you looked at tanks, it was not as noticeable, and if you looked at DPS, it was like, all right, everybody's participating as a DPS. I think that like, it's also a testament to the role and how the role functions. Both healer and tank, I think, fall into the same vein, where it's like, as a DPS, you're looking for a well-balanced composition, where you're looking for DPS to kind of take away some of the disadvantages of your comp, whereas tank and healer, you're looking for the absolute best tank or healer to be those pillars of your composition. And that's, with only one, you have to pick the best, or maybe in some situations you pick the second best.
Yeah.
Okay, last thing. Are there any reworks you'd like to see in 10.1? Anything that's like shooting out to you is like something that you would like to see changed? I actually have something immediately that sticks out to me if you don't.
For me, it's Hunter. I don't know about you. I think Hunter is
yes.
It's like this a spec and a class that we need some defensive changes. I think we need some utility changes. I think to Hunter. I think Hunter needs some reworking like that. Yeah, maybe reworking that owl thing into more of a thing than it currently is. Because right now it's like, it's a little bit cool. You can kind of use it at M+, get some party wide leech, but there is a utility and defensive hole in that class that could be filled.
That was the one that I was looking at too. I'm like, oh yeah, I think that Hunter and DK and Ellie Shaman, honestly, and it's not even necessarily. So for DK and Ellie Shaman and Hunter, honestly, I think the things that they needed reworks in my mind weren't necessarily like how they did damage, but it's just like their raid buff, the lack of a buff in general. Okay, so yeah, DKs have grip, but grip is useful in one fight, whereas Druid has Mark of the Wild, which is useful in every fight, all 8 fights, or something like that. And I think that is just a major misstep for, I mean, Ellie Shaman, I think, should absolutely have something. I see more and more people talk about that specifically. And I don't know the specifics about like Ellie's DPS profile. Maybe a situation where it's like, oh yeah, it's fun to play or something like that. That's fine. If it's good to play, then that's cool. But I'm looking at this on like a more meta level, that DK, Elemental Shaman, Hunter, they need a reason for you to bring them. And I think that it's not a situation where, oh yeah, because in Raid, it's always going to be a problem. And in M+, we're already seeing like people be happy to bring priests for fortitude. You're happy to see a druid for buffs. Like you're bringing classes in M+ for buffs as well. Now, it's not the only reason you're bringing them. Obviously, damage is like probably the most critical thing, but it's something that's an advantage. Whereas like these classes, don't have that. And I think that Hunter was the biggest one and that was the one I was going to say is like, dude, their utility stinks. Like, I'm sorry, but their utility is not good. They need better utility.
Yeah, the binding shot change as well in M plus is like that was a cool and unique thing they had that now is a lot weaker. It's still good against Spiteful, but it's that's not what it used to be.
I don't know, man. I think that they absolutely need some polarizing utility. I would actually like. I wouldn't hate if they got some polarizing utility. We saw some classes actually get pretty significant utility buttons added to their kit. You know, Warriors have like Spear Bastion that can take sometimes. DKs have a bomb limb that they can take. They can take most of the time, and it's like stuff like that is polarizing utility that is very strong in M plus and can potentially be used in raid in some situations. And I wouldn't hate if they had something that was like that. All right. Any specs that you think need like an emergency rework in 10.1? Anything that you think that needs like a pretty significant change? Are you guys kind of agreeance with us where it's like, oh yeah, I think that they should probably be looking to tackle raid buffs, maybe something with like the Hunter class. Overall, have you been happy with class balance this year? I think that's one that's like, I think that most DPS who talk to are going to be happy with class balance. I'm interested in hearing like what non-DPS players also kind of think about the class balance.
I'm sure there are DPS players as well that have some grievances with it. It's not perfect, but
it's never going to be perfect, right?
Pretty good, at least in my opinion, but definitely let us know in the comments what your opinion is.
All right, and we will see you guys in next week's video. Hope you guys all have a great rest of your week, and we will see you later.